Who amongst you is with me? And who is betraying me?
As the Van der Linde gang begin to fall apart, it's put forward by Pinkerton detective agent Andrew Milton that Micah Bell was the one to become turncoat, but was he the first and was he the only? Well, in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at each and every single one of the Van der Linde gang members and dive into the theory as to each one selling out to the authorities, the possible reasoning behind this and their potential gain or motive. There is one exception that we know for certain didn't sell out the gang, as we see their every movement during the narrative, and that of course is Arthur Morgan, so he'll be excluded from today's video, but as for anyone else, it's fair game. Some of these theories will be a little outlandish, but for entertainment's sake, why not? Welcome to the video, you're listening to Phil of Philby Gaming. If you enjoy the following, you all know what to do, and if you're new to the channel and aren't subscribed already, please consider doing so. With that being said, and in no particular order, let's delve down this rabbit hole and see what we can uncover. It could be anyone, the traitor of the Van der Linde gang. The Callander boys and Jenny Kirk. Little is known about the Callander boys, Davy and Mac, and Jenny Kirk, as were all slain due to the events that come to be widely known as the Blackwater Massacre. The rest of the gang thought fondly of the trio, with some such as Hosea and Micah complimenting them later in the story, even discussing how hard it was on Lenny as he felt a connection with Jenny. We of course understand that they weren't there for the final days of the gang's downfall, but did the trio have the potential to turn traitor during their time with Dutch? Mac and Davy were top gunmen for the gang, and although it's unclear as to what Jenny's role may have been, we can happily assume it was similar to the other females of the faction: robbery. Brothers Mac and Davy ran solo from the gang prior to joining, so it's safe to say that they can hold their own. It's possible that they could have been the ones to have dealings with the authorities, primarily the Pinkertons, and made them aware of the ferry heist as to make off with the cash themselves. The same could be said for Jenny. Maybe she was hoping to quietly slip away during the commotion. Maybe all three planned this together. Unfortunately, there isn't enough information on the trio to really dive further into them, prompting me to cluster them up into one theory, so let's move on to our next candidate. Cleet and Joe. Once more, I'll have to cluster two members as there isn't a great deal of information on them. Cleet and Joe, although joining the Van der Linde gang posse late on, did have a history with Micah. Although brought in as extra gunmen for the final train heist, where the gang attempted to relieve its contents of payroll, it's speculated that they were in fact planted into the gang by the Pinkerton detective agency as either moles or spies. The gang was already clearly large enough for the train heist, as we saw earlier in chapter 2, where it took just 4 men to fend off a large amount of pursuing lawmen, so for Micah to bring in these 2 reckless arms seems unnecessary. Having tried to recruit members from the gang into turning, such as Arthur Morgan and Molly O'Shea, it's quite plausible that Agent Milton tried a reverse tactic and planted members into the mix, as opposed to trying to take them out. This ties in with the logic of Micah being the rat, which we'll discuss later in the video. Micah, having already turned at this point, quite possibly may have feared himself to be uncovered soon and advised the Pinkertons that he needed a little backup, and bringing in 2 of his former associates to aid in prying the gang apart for the trio's own selfish needs was the way forward. The trio could have made a deal for their freedom, as Cleet and Joe were already known criminals as well as Micah, with the addition of financial gain. Mary-Beth Gaskill. Mary-Beth was a popular member of the Van der Linde gang, but she of course had her own dreams. She had aspirations of becoming a writer of romantic novels. We see her often mention this throughout our time in the game. Although she did partake in the gang's activities, primarily thieving, her speciality, it's quite possible that Mary-Beth did in fact have loose lips when it came to dealing with the Pinkertons. Her reasoning: Mary-Beth was present throughout the entire downfall of the Van der Linde gang, and although in particular she was close to Arthur Morgan, as we drew closer to the later stages of his life, it had become clear that his days were numbered. Mary-Beth, fearing that the authorities would come through and wipe out the entire gang, could have reached out to them. She saw the gang falling apart and knew that this once close family would soon be coming to an end. Still having dreams of becoming a writer, Mary-Beth may have informed the Pinkertons as to the gang's activities in exchange for their freedom and her earlier crimes themselves being wiped from the records. This theory stems from the fact that when finally achieving her dream, Mary-Beth uses a pen name as opposed to her own. I understand that this is a common decision by some writers, but why would she want all that glory but be unable to take the credit? Unless part of her deal was to use a different alias as to not reassociate herself with her past. Tilly Jackson. Tilly Jackson isn't as innocent as she appears to be, as once stated by the gang's arbiter, Susan Grimshaw. Tilly had a history of running with other criminals prior to her time in the Van der Linde gang, mainly the Foreman brothers. After receiving some form of abuse at the hands of one of the Foreman boys, Tilly did what she had to do in order to escape their clutches. She killed the cousin of Anthony Foreman, head Pearson behind the gang. This shows us that Tilly is willing to do whatever is necessary in order to survive, and although she was much closer to the Van der Linde gang than she was the Foreman brothers, she still had a history of escaping her situation by any means. She of course had good reason to leave her previous posse of outlaws, but as the Van der Linde gang began to decline, Tilly could have witnessed that Dutch in particular wasn't the man he once was, and that her current family were beginning to turn on one another. Not wanting to be part of this, Miss Jackson may have contacted the Pinkertons to exchange a deal and once more escape. During the epilogue, where John can now find a heavily pregnant Tilly Jackson, now known as Tilly Pierre in Saint-Denis, Tilly tells of how she married a lawyer, quite the opposing lifestyle to the one she led previously. Although she states in the letter to John and Abigail, addressed to them at Beecher's home, she may have taken on an entirely new identity, even being placed in some sort of witness protection program. Karen Jones. Karen was no doubt an active member of the Van der Linde gang, even willing to put herself in far more dangerous situations than the other girls of the gang, such as the bank robbery in the livestock town of Valentine, where she was both the first through the door and the first to face the lawman waiting outside. Karen also wasn't afraid to speak her mind when it comes to those who would challenge her, such as Susan Grimshaw and Bonnie O'Shea. She could definitely hold her own, but after the death of her on-again off-again partner, Sean MacGuire, Karen Jones, who was known to already enjoy a drink or two, delved deeper into the bottle as a way to battle her grief. This continued on through the later chapters of the game, meaning that the player was lucky at some points to even find Karen sober. Karen's drunken antics didn't exactly keep her incognito, leading to speculation that the Pinkertons could have easily discovered her whereabouts in any of the town saloons. Due to her constant intoxicated state, detectives could have manipulated Karen into giving up the gang's location or planned heists as long as she vowed to walk away from her past life. Karen Jones is the only member of the Van der Linde gang, whom nobody seems to know what became of her, although Tilly speculates she possibly died due to her habits. Sean MacGuire. It's strongly believed, due to how fast the Pinkerton Detective Agency, alongside local lawmen, turned up at the Blackwater ferry heist, that there was indeed an informant. Sean MacGuire was present during this and was the only one captured who was left unscathed. Fast forward later in the story, during the Saint-Denis bank job, because John Marston had a similar outcome to Sean MacGuire in relation to being captured alive whilst others were killed, Dutch believes this to be a strong indication of disloyalty and betrayal. So is it plausible to think the same of the young Irishman? I understand that after his capture, bounty hunters are set to exchange Sean with a separate group as he's being transported to prison for his part in the ferry heist, which almost contradicts this theory, but it's quite possible that Sean made a deal with the Pinkertons, only for them later to go back on their word and imprison him anyway. This is when Sean would rejoin the gang once more after his rescue. Was Sean left unscathed intentionally, or was he just lucky? Josiah Trewlany. Although not considered to be a full member of the Van der Linde gang, more of a close associate, Josiah Trewlany still has his uses. Frequenting in and out of the gang, albeit suspicious, can be explained as we learned that Josiah is actually a married man with children. But is this the sole reason for his constant departure? Josiah is a con artist whom often tricks others, but his biggest flaw, he doesn't know how to keep quiet, and the gang are fully aware of this. Josiah always seems to have inside information when it comes to those pursuing the gang, and often drops them information such as the whereabouts of Sean MacGuire following his capture in Blackwater, and that there are super agents now on the heels of the Van der Linde gang following their recent heists. Is he simply playing both sides? One could speculate that the trickster is all about financial gain for both himself and his family, and intends to keep the two separate. Later in the story, when Arthur gives him his blessing to leave the gang once and for all, it may very well be that Josiah was aware that the Pinkertons would be arriving at the gang's camp soon, and he knew he may be slain during the battle, but he couldn't just up and leave, as he may then be considered to be the rat, so he awaited Arthur's blessing to deter any suspicion. Reverend Orville Swanson. Orville Swanson wasn't known for making the most logical decisions throughout his life. A once respected man of the cloth, he later fell victim of his habits of drinking and narcotic use, leading to the Vandalin gang members often having to bail him out of situations. Following the gang inadvertently fleeing to Guam, when Sadie takes the leadership reins of the outlaws, Reverend Swanson realises the life he's leading isn't one of virtue, and becomes the man he formerly was. Now seeing things much more clearly, he's witness to the shambles and sees the future of the gang. He knows this isn't a life for him. Similar to Trewlany, Swanson flees the gang before its final downfall, where the Pinkertons attack Beaver Hollow. He may have been fully aware of this upcoming situation and wanted out before it occurred. His time with the gang was over, and he wished to return to his previous devotion to God, beckoning others to follow in his footsteps. He did try and convince other gang members to leave with him in an attempt to save him, all to no avail, as he knew the Pinkertons would be upon them soon. Leopold Strauss. The gang's bookkeeper and loan shark is a slithering man, often manipulating innocent locals into loaning money and having Arthur collect, often in violent situations, sometimes even encouraging this type of behaviour. He's greedy, as we see during the latter stages of Arthur's life, where he continues to push Arthur into collecting on these loans, even when fully aware that he soon may pass. He seems to have very little concern for his fellow gang members, and often only concerned with monetary gain. Of course, we see that Arthur is the one to evict him from the camp after finally having enough of his ways, but it's quite possible that Strauss may have been in cahoots with the Pinkertons, potentially receiving a payout of some sorts, and was simply waiting the final payment from the debt collections before fleeing by his own accord. We do learn later from Charles Smith that Strauss was picked up by the authorities and tortured for information on the gang, and that he apparently died in custody after not saying a word, but no one knows this for certain. Charles Smith. The theory that Charles Smith was a betrayer will certainly raise some eyebrows, but let's discuss it anyway. Throughout the title, Charles is often known for his loyalty to the gang, claiming it's a much more stable life than running solo, wondering if someone's going to kill him in his sleep, but over time he witnesses, just as everybody else, the gang becoming unhinged. He does remain loyal to the likes of Arthur Morgan, but as far as Dutch van der Linde himself is concerned, he foresees what would become of the gang due to Dutch's declining mental state and irrational behaviour and decision making. It may be for this reason alone that Charles decided not to sell out the entire Van der Linde gang to the Pinkertons, but possibly just Dutch himself. Charles' loyalty is unmatched, but he possibly felt with the gang's current leader out of the equation, someone more fitting could step into the role, even if it's not Charles himself. During the escape following the Saint Denis bank heist, Charles bravely exposes himself to the searching Pinkertons in an attempt to draw them away from the gang. It's possible that the pursuers caught up with Charles, and that's when some sort of deal was struck to take down Dutch. If we think back to a quote earlier in the game from Agent Milton himself, he stated he wasn't so much interested in arresting all of the gang members, just Dutch. Simon Pearson. Simon Pearson, the gang's cook, is something of a fanatic. We learn this during his wild stories from his time at sea, again whilst reading his letter addressed to his Aunt Cathy, and once more when he's trying to convince Dutch about making peace with longtime foe Colm O'Driscoll, where he perceives himself as something similar to a caged tiger when it comes to combat. At any point, Pearson could have been feeding the Pinkertons information on Dutch and the rest of the gang, but the theory that he's the betrayer stems from his life following the fall of the gang. Openly admitting to coercing with the O'Driscolls during a time we learned that Colm himself had set up a deal with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and of course being present when said Pinkertons arrived at the camp of Clements Point, makes the agency aware of Pearson's involvement with the gang. Pearson left right before the Battle of Beaver's Hollow, similar to a few others, indicating that he may have been aware of the upcoming assault, but when meeting him in the epilogue, we learned that he's now running the general store in Rhodes, without even using a false alias. Further adding to this, he happily hangs a picture frame of the Van der Linde gang in his store for all of the world to see. So why would he expose his past so openly unless he had nothing to fear? Did he strike a deal with the Pinkertons for his freedom in exchange for turning on the gang? Kieran Duffy. When the gang first learned of Kieran Duffy's existence, at that time he's working for rivaling gang leader Colm O'Driscoll. After fleeing from Colm's posse following the attack from the Van der Linde gang during the prologue, he's soon captured and taken into the custody of Dutch and others. After tying him up to a tree for a few weeks, starving him and tormenting him as to find information on the whereabouts of Colm, Kieran finally caves and gives up his former gang leader's location. This indicates that Kieran falls under the questioning given the circumstances. Kieran is often belittled and tormented by the other gang members, even after saving Arthur's life. With the exception of a select few, he's not even considered to be part of the Van der Linde gang per se, and is treated as something of an outsider, even by the likes of Arthur, so it's very possible that after trying to prove himself over and over to this gang of misfits that won't accept him, he finally gave up and decided to take up Milton's offer of telling on the gang. After the rescue of Jack Marston, where the gang celebrate, Kieran goes missing. Although it's apparent he's been kidnapped by the rivaling O'Driscolls, it's not far-fetched to think that he took the opportunity after the entire gang had passed out drunk to align himself with the Pinkertons, who after gaining whatever information they needed, fed him to the O'Driscolls, who we already know were in dealings with the agents. Uncle. Everyone's favourite uncle has been part of the Van der Linde gang for Lord knows how many years. He's been witness to the growth of the outlaw faction from a very small group to a much larger posse, now considered a family. Uncle is a lot smarter than he's initially given credit for, as we see during his time helping John at Peter's Hope. He's been involved with the gang's ups and downs and seen the highs and lows of Dutch Van der Linde's behaviour. During the final days, when the gang reside at Peter's Hollow, Dutch Van der Linde informs Arthur that a few of the gang members have departed. This includes Uncle. Immediately, Dutch refers to Uncle as a coward and a traitor because of this, but in reality, Uncle's reason for leaving, as put forward to Tilly Jackson, is that he was running to save himself. Uncle fully understood that the gang were spiralling and didn't want to be part of that. He'd witnessed Dutch becoming unhinged before, but recognised at this point that there was no turning back for the man. Uncle, in Red Dead Redemption 2, was not much more than a coward whom often avoided violence. He may very well have become an informant after deciding to flee the gang, with the hopes that the Pinkertons would take care of anyone who may possibly pursue him. A far-fetched theory, I'll admit, but at least it's something to think about. Susan Grimshaw. Potentially the least likely to be working undercover for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but let's take a look at Susan. Susan Grimshaw had been with the gang almost from the get-go, when it was just Dutch, Arthur, Hosea and possibly John Marston. Much like Uncle, she'd seen the brighter days of the gang and too witnessed the downfall of Dutch's mental decline. Susan knew Dutch better than most in the camp and would definitely have been able to sense that the leader would not be able to bounce back from the current state he was in. Similar to Charles Smith, Susan may have been the informant in hopes of the Pinkertons targeting Dutch solely, as she did have a strong love for everyone in the gang, and didn't wish to see the family she'd known and cared about for so many years, something she'd watched and helped grow, before because of a madman's decision making. This feeling may have been enhanced after Susan put down Molly O'Shea for her apparent betrayal, and several of the gang members ridiculed her for this, even though it was a heavily followed rule within the Van der Linde gang. It may have been at this point she understood what the gang had become, and felt no one had each other's backs anymore. She saw the problem to this, Dutch. So to take him out of the equation in hopes of returning the family to the way it used to be doesn't sound so crazy. Sadie Adler. Mrs. Sadie Adler was brought into the mix at the very start of the game, following a rescue from Dutch, but very late in terms of the Van der Linde gang. Although she was often comforted by other members after the loss of her husband, Sadie would often feel, especially during the earlier chapters, that this wasn't her family. More than likely, it was her grief speaking, of course. As time passed, she would become a fully fledged member of the gang, being accepted very quickly. But as Sadie stated to Arthur later in the game, the Dutch Van der Linde of now was not the same Dutch Van der Linde who warmed her in a blanket during a rescue from her flaming home. She knew he had changed, and like many others, she had a strong love for this family, as shown when she took the reins following the gang fleeing to Guarma. She may have felt that the missing outlaws were never going to return, prompting her actively to become a leader of her newfound family. But when Dutch returned and everyone witnessed a strong change in his character, she could have done what she needed to protect the one she loved. Lenny Summers. Being the youngest member of the Van der Linde gang could have also made Lenny Summers the most impressionable. Although considered to be a grown man, Lenny was only 19 years of age during 1899, and having only been with the gang for a few months prior to the Blackwater ferry heist, he may have felt he didn't know as much loyalty as to others who had been with them for years. He's often seen challenging Dutch's teachings, and although it's mostly in a respectful manner, Lenny is still challenging his mentor and leader. This may have been perceived as something of a teenage rebellious characteristic due to his age, but it also could be seen he sees flaws in Dutch's beliefs. On the run from the law, before falling in with Dutch for protection, Lenny may have fell for the silver tongue of this newly found mentor, but as time passed, a realisation set in, making him realise that it was nothing more than talk. Lenny was with Dutch during the trolley heist, and after the head bash that Dutch received, Dutch's ways began to change for the worse. He no longer treated the gang the same, often barking at them. Although this one is unlikely, it may be that Lenny fell in with the Pinkertons as a means to escape a life with an already declining Dutch, once again due to his age, easily being manipulated by the agency. Bill Williamson. Although we see Bill Williamson side with Dutch during the final showdown between the gang, it could be perceived that he had dealings with the Pinkertons. Not known for his smarts, Bill may easily be manipulated into coercing with the agents in exchange for the prevention of arrest for any of his previous crimes. After the gang reunite following the return from Guam, Bill bursts through the front door soaking wet and irate, and it's only moments later that the agents turn up. Some believe he was the one talking to them prior to this, but due to the fact of how hard he fought back against the agency, this doesn't seem likely. This theory stems more from the fact that Bill in the first Red Dead Redemption game states to John, "No more Dutch and no more you," indicating that Bill had a hatred towards John, albeit kept quiet during RDR2. Following the firefight at the Cay, Bill may well have turned informant after truly understanding the power of the Pinkertons. Further adding to this, when the gang separate and flee Beaver's Hollow, Bill, alongside Javier, initially break away with Dutch, but soon head off in their own direction as the Pinkertons chase Dutch down. Javier Escuella. Similar to Bill Williamson, Javier separated from the group following the fall of the gang. For someone who claimed loyalty to Dutch for all of these years, it makes no sense as to why Javier would suddenly separate from his mentor unless he was the one who led the Pinkertons to their location. After all, it's Javier who's the first to spot the Pinkertons approaching Beaver's Hollow before anyone else. Was he hoping the gang would surrender? Did they have some deal with the agents similar to that theorised of Bill Williamson? Javier would often question the gang's loyalty to Dutch, even though it was clear he was mentally declining and the decisions he was making for the gang were irrational. Was this Javier's way of deflecting any accusation of treachery that may fall towards him? Further adding to this, when John reunites with Javier in Mexico, he's quick to sell Dutch out, although the location given to John, Colombia, is false, and this was more likely Javier trying to save his own skin. John doesn't seem too surprised that his former brother was willing to give up Dutch Van der Linde so easily. Now, onto the most plausible candidates. Hosea Matthews. Hosea Matthews was one of the two founding members of the Van der Linde gang, formed after both himself and Dutch had attempted to steal from one another way back when, before ultimately deciding to team up. Not a single member of the gang knows Dutch better than Hosea, including Arthur Morgan. We see the duo constantly go back and forth against one another, with Hosea always trying to do what's best. Although the pair are considered to be equals by many members of the gang, the role of leader seems to have landed in Dutch's lap, even naming the gang after himself. This may be due to him being the more charismatic of the two and having more of a leadership quality, but with Hosea's constant questioning of Dutch's decisions right from the beginning, this begs the premise that maybe Hosea wanted more of a leadership role himself. Hosea's illness plays a large part in this theory. As the gang arrive at Horseshoe Overlook, Hosea informs Dutch that he's worried and he hasn't got long left and wants the gang members safe before he goes. Although Dutch immediately agrees with this statement, it makes you wonder why Hosea would have to make it in the first place. If he truly believed Dutch was doing the right thing, making the right decisions, he wouldn't need to make an obvious statement such as this. We later see during camp interactions that Hosea is trying to convince both John and Abigail to pack up their things and leave. Is this because he's foreseeing the downfall of the Van der Linde gang before anyone else? Was he trying to save his family before it was too late, either before the gang fell or his own passing? The theory could stretch as far as Hosea allowing himself to be captured during the Saint-Denis bank heist with the intention of Dutch surrendering in fear of his friend's life, only to have this backfire, ultimately leading to the final moments in Hosea's life. He may have made a deal with the Pinkertons, only for them to renege on the agreement. Molly O'Shea. We're all aware of the confession given by Molly, ultimately causing her demise, as that's what happened to betrayers, and even though in the final moments of the main story, Agent Milton confesses to Arthur that the actual gang rat was Micah Bell, there are some, including myself, that speculate Milton may have been covering for Molly. I've covered an entire video on this, as well as other more detailed theories which I'll leave linked in the video description below, but for the time being, let's just discuss a brief overview. Molly O'Shea and her partner Dutch van der Linde are always bickering with one another, and as the main story progresses, these small back and forths escalate into heated arguments. Molly is clearly upset with the apparent lack of attention that she feels Dutch is giving her, and constantly accuses him of locking eyes, so to speak, with other female members of the gang. Although the pair do have the odd romantic moments with one another, this venomous spitting is the primary to their relationship. We see time and time again of Molly's frustrations towards Dutch, sometimes even indicating that she's nervous about telling him something important. Some believe this to be the fact that Molly's pregnant with child, but that's another story for another time. The traitor theory stems from such things as Molly approaching Arthur, mentioning about how Dutch feels about loyalty for example, plus heated interactions between the two. It's also aided by Agent Milton's words to Arthur in his final moments, where he points out that Molly wasn't a traitor, that they questioned her a few times but she never talked a word. Some believe that Milton was simply covering for Molly at this point, as he isn't actually aware of her passing, and plans to continue to work alongside her in bringing justice to the Van der Linde gang they now have a mutual distaste for. Molly's disapproval of the gang is noted in several moments of the game. One example is a poem she has written, which can be found just outside of her and Dutch's tent, in which she shows her true feelings toward the Van der Linde gang members, referring to them as parasites. Another is moments before her death, when in a heavily intoxicated state, she manages to belittle the outlaws individually. All of this combined prompts the theory that the false confession to being the traitor was indeed a true claim. Micah Bell. Old Micah Bell, the actual claimed rat of the gang. Now of course, we're aware of his betrayal as confessed to us by Milton, but what was claimed was that he only turned after being picked up by the agents upon his arrival back following the gang's time in Guarma, but there's a theory that his betrayal began long before this. Dutch and Micah met at a saloon in the north of the Grizzlies named Crenshaw Hills. Dutch was in there attempting to sell off some gold that he and the gang had stolen in a deal that unfortunately went sour. Micah Bell was at this saloon and unselfishly intervened in the altercation, promptly saving Dutch's life. Following this action, Dutch welcomed him into the gang with open arms. It would seem an open and closed case, except for one or two small details. Was it just happenstance for Micah to be at that saloon, or was he there for another purpose? After rescuing Micah from the Strawberry Jail, then visiting his hermit camp later on, after he's reunited with the gang, there's a very interesting scrap of paper that predominantly adds to the theory we're discussing. A small bounty poster of none other than Dutch van der Linde himself had been in Micah's possession all along. Giving it only for $1,000, and by 1899 the price of Dutch's top gunman, Arthur Morgan, is set at $5,000, indicates that this is a very old wanted poster. It's apparent that Micah had been on the trail for Dutch for some time, but after finding him in a saloon, why choose to side with him instead of cashing in on the bounty? I'd wager that he saw the gold Dutch was trying to sell, and may have realised that it would be more profitable to work alongside Dutch instead. It's clear throughout the main story that Micah is jealous of the relationship between Arthur Morgan and Dutch van der Linde. He wants himself to be Dutch's top gunman. This explains the constant belittling of Arthur, especially after he becomes more ill, and as Dutch begins to show signs of a declining mental spiral, Micah jumps at the opportunity to whisper in his ear, controlling the majority of the decisions he makes. This can be further speculated by Micah heavily prompting Dutch to meet Colm O'Driscoll to make peace, in an event that turned out to be an ambush. It's theorised that Micah set this up, with the hopes of eliminating Arthur to become Dutch's second. Micah excels from wanting to be a top gunman for the gang and now wanting to be the leader. This prompts the theory that Micah, for the second time, is willing to turn on Dutch. John Marston. The theory that John Marston was the gang's rat actually comes from the top man himself, Dutch van der Linde. Similar to the Sean MacGuire theory, during the hail of bullets raining down on the gang during the Saint-Denis bank heist, where members such as Hosea Matthews and Lenny Summers were both slain, John Marston was taken into custody miraculously unscathed. This prompts Dutch to question John's motives, claiming that maybe things are going exactly the way John wants them to. But as far as John's motives for becoming the betrayer to the gang seems nothing more than family motivated. John has a history of leaving the gang. It's well documented that he disappeared for around a year or more when Jack was just a baby, but since returning, especially as the narrative progressed, John's maturity advanced and he began to learn to put his family's well-being first. John begins to question Dutch's actions more and more, and as the gang begin to disband into two separate factions, John sides against Dutch. Before his capture, during the bank heist where he was brought into captivity, it's believed John made a deal with the Pinkertons on behalf of himself and his family. Adding to this, it's believed that this is why Abigail was never captured even though Hosea was when the duo were together. Furthering this, it may have been planned that the Pinkertons were anticipating Dutch to attempt a prison break on John, albeit his love for the man had far gone at this point, and were hoping to capture Dutch and bring him into custody during this. Everybody at this point in the narrative can see that the gang, once a family, was beginning to fall apart. It's notable that Dutch cares less and less for those he once called sons, daughters and brothers, and John wants to break his family free of all this before it's too late. Abigail Roberts. One of the strongest theories, something that I've covered in a video previously myself, is that the second traitor, or original traitor if you will, was actually Abigail Roberts. There's so many tiny details suggestive towards this that it's a difficult one to ignore, but the basis of it, Abigail wants to take her son Jack and his father John away from the chaotic and hazardous lifestyle that the van der Linde gang of outlaws lead. There's a small interaction between Hosea Matthews and Abigail herself shortly after the gang arrive at Horseshoe. Abigail expresses to Hosea how she's very concerned about the life with the gang and the welfare of her son. Hosea advises Abigail that she should break away from the gang for their child's safety. There's a strong relationship bond between Abigail and Hosea, sort of a father-daughter with her and a father-grandson with Jack. Abigail is always looking to Hosea to help with Jack, whether it be teaching him to read or making him a fishing pole for example, so it's a bit questionable as to why Abigail, in the later stages of chapter 2, asks Arthur instead of her usual choice of Hosea to do something with Jack. This of course is the fishing trip, in which the Pinkertons discover Arthur's location and attempt to make him turn. It's theorised that Abigail informed the Pinkertons of Arthur's location, whereas they would attempt to coerce him into turning on not only the gang, but Dutch van der Linde himself. She knew that Arthur wouldn't slay the two agents in front of Jack, and that's why she felt comfortable sending the two out together. Upon returning from the fishing trip, Abigail instinctively knows there's something wrong, even though there's nothing to indicate this. It's as if she knew what has already happened. Later in chapter 3, Abigail's son is kidnapped by the Braithwaite family and placed into the custody of Angelo Bronte. Shortly following this, the Pinkertons coincidentally find the gang's location once more. In this particular scene, Abigail is nowhere to be seen. It's as if she informed the agents of the gang's location, as she was now becoming more and more aware of the dangers this life were posing to herself and Jack, and felt that if she had Dutch and the others disposed of, the Pinkertons would be able to assist her in tracking down her child. Another potential lead is that during the heist on the bank in Saint-Denis, Abigail somehow manages to slip away when in the company of Hosea Matthews, even though he was both captured and executed. We could even stretch to the theory that Abigail sacrificed Hosea, so to speak, but why would she do this? She may have made a deal with the Pinkertons, whereas they would use Hosea as a bait in an attempt to have Dutch surrender, which is exactly what happened. The theory goes on to speculate that the agents, after several of Abigail's attempts to betray the gang, which ultimately kept failing, finally decided they'd had enough and attempt to wipe out the entire gang at Linde, even though they're aware of Abigail and Jack's presence. One of the final pieces of evidence is during Molly's confession at Beaver Hollow. When Molly states that she's the one who made the Pinkertons aware of both Dutch's plans and locations, Abigail begins to look visibly upset about this. It's as if she knows that the confession is falsified and what fate is about to befall Molly. She's feeling guilty for this, that someone else is paying the price for what she has done. There's so much more to this theory, so much that I'd suggest watching the video on it in its entirety, which I'll leave linked in the video description. Whatever your theory is as to who the real betrayer was, or if there was even a betrayer at all, I truly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you all know what to do. If you're new to the channel and aren't subscribed already, please consider doing so. Are there any theories, speculations, characters or scenarios for example that you wish to see me cover? Please don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section. Thank you all for watching. You've been listening to Phil of Philby Gaming, and I'll see you in the next video.